Hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking to you about quality. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I know it's early, but what better thing to talk about at 9 a.m. than testing, right? So that's why I'm here. Today's title is Quality Management, or the Cost of Not Automating Your Tests. My name is Michael Dailey. I am the Director of Technical Product Marketing here at Provar. I've been with the company now for 5 years in April and started out doing some consulting, kind of a DevOps consultant type of role, test automation and things like that. Prior to that, worked as a software engineer in different test automation capacities and DevOps as well. So that's kind of my background. As always, there's this really long wall of text that I have to show you. You know the deal. Before I get into it, I'd like to talk a little bit about who we are as a company. So Provar was founded in 2014 with the sole purpose of providing a better experience for being able to test Salesforce, but also the full gambit of whatever you're testing. We've been the leader in the Salesforce testing space for 10 years now, and we were founded by experts in the Salesforce ecosystem. So that's really been our niche and where we've kind of found our home. We are a global company, so that's a little bit about who we are. Now, getting into it. I'm actually here today to talk to you about bugs. We all have them, although some of us may refer to them as features, right, instead of bugs. So what is the actual cost of a bug? Before we get into it, I think it's important to discuss why we test to begin with. First of all, you test to ensure quality, right? The only purpose that you would test something is if it's changing over time, and Salesforce is always changing. We're always making changes to our orgs. So by necessity, we need to test them to make sure things are working properly and to ensure the quality of our orgs. But another one of the major factors can be cost. Not testing costs money, believe it or not, and the more you don't test, the more bugs you typically see in your production environments. So this graph here shows the relative cost of a bug moving through the software development lifecycle. So you obviously, earlier on, there's not much cost because you're catching things in the requirements of the design phase. But as it gets closer to a more production-like environment, it's pretty understandable that it's going to cost you more money to find those bugs and also resolve them because you're doing a lot of backtracking, right? And you can really see how the exponential increase is kind of showcased here. So it stands to reason, the earlier we find and resolve the problem, the less money it costs our business, which is great. The realistic challenge here that we face is that it is a best practice to shift testing left, right? But this can be very time consuming, and a lot of times it slows down our release process where we're trying to test more and to test more often. So the resolution to this challenge is to implement some form of test automation. But like all digital transformation projects, the journey to automation is one that involves proper planning, thought, and execution. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Now, I'd like to debunk a common myth or misconception that automation is not for everyone. Automation isn't just for us, or maybe it doesn't fit our team, or we're a manual testing team. I don't think that we'd be able to pick up and use automation easily. Respectfully, I'd have to disagree here. I think that the number one reason why all businesses exist is to ultimately earn a profit and continue to scale and be profitable. Scalability is kind of the main thing that we're talking about here when we're talking about testing. If you're manually testing something, it's just not a scalable process. So a lot of people have been making the push towards implementing DevOps best practices and more recently, more AI and generative artificial frameworks, because you want your businesses to scale, you want them to be competitive, and you want them to ultimately succeed. So automation was kind of made with that same thought process. You want scalability and maintainability to be at the forefront. So with that being said, turn that frown upside down. Automation is for everyone. So I'd like to get that on the table. Now, as I said, I'm here today to talk to you about quality. So a huge part of quality is testing, and testing in an automated way is kind of the inevitable scalable solution. So how, you might ask, do we go from manually testing to automated testing? Well, first, you need to evaluate what your team's testing needs are. This is going to differ based on your current team's makeup and what you're good at and things like that, which is what we'll get into first. Next, we'll talk about how you can select an automation solution that's best suited for your particular team and some kind of gotchas there. Then I'll talk through an overview of how to properly implement said solution. After that, we'll dive into some best practices around automation and how we can manage transitioning a team from being a manual testing team to an automated testing one. And lastly, we'll discuss how we can take a look back at what we've done so far and measure our success and look at some different metrics for automation to improve. Also at the very end, please stay tuned, I will do a brief demo of kind of our product suite that'll give you an overview of how automation looks like from Provar. So the first thing, evaluating our testing needs. We're going to be looking at our current team's skill sets, as I said. What do we currently have familiarity with? Are we a team that's familiar with new tools? We pick them up very easily, or is there a lot of friction usually with adoption and implementing them with our current business processes and things like that? Also, it's going to matter whether or not your team is familiar with programming and different things like that, because that may change what type of automation solution they want to adopt. You also don't want to necessarily throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. You want to look at what you do well and carry that forward into your automated testing processes as well. And the big thing here is just really looking at where automation can provide you the most value as a company. The next thing that you'll evaluate is the frequency of testing. This is really where you'll see a lot of the time savings. So how often are you actually testing something manually? And what level are you performing that testing? Are you doing full-blown regression testing every week manually? That adds up over time. And really the biggest thing is the number of hours that you're dedicating solely to testing for every release. If you're doing all this manually every single time you have a release, you can see how those hours would be very exponentially increased. The last thing that you'll evaluate here is the complexity of the testing that you're doing. So I have a depiction here of a rabbit hole because really what you're trying to find out is how deep does that rabbit hole go? What do we really want to involve in the testing process and how many different applications are going to be involved? Are we interested in testing just Salesforce or are we more interested in testing the full end-to-end business processes? And then the different types of testing. There's more than just the ones that I've listed here. There's dozens, if not maybe even 100 different types of testing that you could be performing, from performance testing, regression, functional, unit testing, you name it. So you really need to think about what makes sense for your team and what the requirements are. That's going to help you determine what type of automation solution you're going to adopt. Okay, so there's two different types of evaluations that we're going to be focusing on. One is the product evaluation, where we're going to be looking at some more generic concepts. This is going to change based on your team because obviously there's going to be feature sets and checkboxes that you'll want to make sure that the product has before you select it. But from a more general sense, you really want to make sure that the tests you're creating are resilient. What we mean by that is if you create a test today, you don't want to have to continuously update that said test every time you make a change or every time Salesforce pushes changes. Another concept here is reusability and modularity. You want tests to be portable. You want them to be applicable to a multitude of different use cases. So not just your development environment, but also QA. You also want them to be shareable in the sense that if I create something over here, I can collaborate with my other team members and they can gain access to what I've done as well. Which kind of leads into the next point is the ease of use. So how easy the product is to actually pick up and use and learn and continue to be successful in. This is going to be a huge impact on your adoption of the solution. End-to-end testing may or may not be a requirement for you if you're only interested in testing Salesforce. So this may not apply. However, you definitely want to be thinking about end-to-end testing capabilities when you're evaluating solutions to make sure that they fit your needs, such as integrating with APIs, testing external websites outside of Salesforce, maybe Experience Cloud, Marketing Cloud, all the different applications that may be involved. Interoperability is important, and really what we mean here is how well does the product work with your current tool stack? How well does it integrate with your business processes and your day-to-day kind of operations? Does it integrate with things like Jira, project management tools that you're using? These are going to be really important when it comes to, again, adopting the tool and using it. And the last point here on the product side is the cost of ownership. So rather than just the price tag, but the actual cost of using the tool and maintaining it over time. There's a lot of times there's a lot of cost associated with just that you want to evaluate and think about ahead of time. So product stuff is great, right? If we've hit all the check boxes there, we could evaluate 5 different tools and maybe they all hit the same check boxes. But a lot of times the differences may come on the right half here where we're evaluating the vendor itself. So support is a big thing. We don't want to be dead in the water if we encounter a showstopper. If there's something that we can't do in the solution, or if it's not working for us, or if we can't do a very specific task that is part of our requirements, that's halting a release, then support is going to be paramount in that case. Another part of this is the training and the onboarding. So whenever you're adopting a solution, onboarding is very important. Obviously, you want that to be a smooth process. And the long-term success of you, the customer. You want to make sure that they're equally as invested in your long-term success as a customer, and not just looking to get that one-year deal, but really looking down the road, making sure that you can continue to be successful with their solution. So these are a little bit more generic concepts, but now that we've selected our automation solution, let's talk about how we might implement one properly. The first thing is the automation owners. So who's going to actually own this effort? Like any tool, if you buy a tool, it may or may not solve the problem for you. You need people to actually use the tool. You can't just buy things to fix your problems. Ultimately, someone has to own it, right? Which leads me into my next point, and that is adoption. How many of you have been on teams where your manager or someone on your team said, hey, we just got this new software, this application. We need you and your team to start using it immediately. And you're like already groaning because you're thinking, oh man, I got to learn another new tool to try to keep up with my day-to-day work that I'm already doing. Well, first of all, I definitely feel your pain there, but I also think that it's up to the automation owners to make sure that they're being kind of the evangelist for the tool internally, and they're encouraging adoption, and they're kind of convincing you, hey, here's the value that we're getting out of it, here's the value that you will get if you're adopting it in the same way. So that leads more into kind of planning. So when we're thinking about planning, there's short and long term. Short term, more 30, 60 days. What are we really hoping to accomplish? What are we hoping to get done? This could be more of a kind of a general concept, but when you get into long-term planning, like 90 days or more, you want to start thinking about some actual KPIs that you want to define around testing. For example, do you want to have 80% test coverage, or would you rather have 10% reduction in defect retention rates, or are you looking to reduce your release times by 3 days? Any of those are valuable, right? But you definitely want it to be measurable so you can track against it over time. Oh, and sidebar, please don't say you want 100% test coverage. It's not going to happen. Integrations. So thinking about integrations at the forefront is very important. Make it a priority. Don't spend money and then wait a year to start thinking about how you're actually going to integrate this into your pipeline, right? Think about that at the very beginning, because there's people that are involved in that process that need to know what you're doing. A lot of times they're not on the calls at the right times, and you end up having to chase them down and say, oh, our DevOps guy, he works different hours, he's busy with this, so we can't integrate it today, so let's get back to you next week. Next week he's on holiday, you wait a month. Anyway, you get the point. So you definitely want to be thinking about this early on. Now, we've talked about how we can kind of implement. Let's look at some best practices. So first of all, this is going to be an ongoing thing that you're going to get better at, but it's how you identify test cases that you actually want to automate. Again, I said don't say all of them, right? It's not 100%. This is actually a prioritization process where you're looking at, okay, what are our knowns, what are our unknowns, and what do we actually want to test? Something that's going to help you with this is also creating some way to map your manual test cases to your automated test cases. You want to be able to track against this over time so you can measure your progress. So you can see, oh, I have 70% of my test cases automated. Maybe I want to get to 80% by the end of the quarter. You can actually track against that if you're mapping them properly. Usually you need some kind of a test management solution for this. So that would be something that we would recommend. Now, another part of this is thinking about different types of coverage that you want. So there's risk coverage, which is really more of thinking about the impact and the severity versus just the raw test coverage. So when you're thinking about which test to automate first, keep that in mind. Now, when we're thinking about our testing environments, it can be very tempting to have a quick win or quick success in earlier stages, or your developer sandboxes or scratch orgs where you're testing things. The temptation is then to run everything everywhere, but that may not be the best practice in this sense. You want to think about this from a requirement standpoint. Which orgs are we actually considering automation in? How often do we need to test them? If we're only pushing to production every year, once a year or twice a year, we may not even need to automate anything there, because We can probably do that manually if it's only happening 2 times. So the cadence at which you're actually testing an environment really determines the need for automation in that environment. And then there's also just the different applications that you may be wanting to include outside of just Salesforce. A big point here for best practice is data management. I see this all the time where you have a sandbox org and you're looking for a very specific user, and that's the user that you use for all of your flows or maybe a lot of your scenarios. You know, Marty McTester 123, right? We all seen him, we all know he exists. But he may not be there tomorrow. He may not be there after you have a sandbox refresh, and if you didn't seed your sandboxes, the data's not there, well then you're kind of left wondering, how do I create that record so I can then run my test? And it's a little bit of a process, right? So that is to say, data seeding and data cleanup processes should be a requirement for automation. It's a best practice here to not rely on pre-existing data when you're doing automation, because that can be a potential failure. That's not actually a failure of the test itself. Another great point here is be thinking about scalability. So similar to programming or development, you're always thinking about, okay, I don't want to write code that's going to work for one day. Ideally, I'd like this code to work for a long time. And I want to be able to come back to it and maintain it properly. It's the same way with test automation and test data. You want there to be something that you can come back to and pick up and you can share and other people can understand easily. So, in summary for that point, be a good roommate, clean up after yourselves. So, moving on. Visibility is very important for any digital transformation project. And this starts with proper reporting. So really the key here is a good reporting tool is both centralized and easily accessible, so everyone can access it. Stands to reason, right? And it should be easily digestible in the sense that if you look at a test report, it's not something that you have to require an engineer to interpret. You should be able to look at it and understand at a high level what's going on with that run. You should also be able to get some impact out of that test results, out of those test results. So it's not just a pretty graph to look at, but rather it's something that we can take as an input and then make some changes and then get a better output, like a performance review, which we all love, or a report card or something like that. So, that being said, let's look now at kind of how we adjust based on our metrics for long-term success. So how can we continuously make improvements? Well, obviously you need to monitor your test metrics. Those KPIs that you define during implementation, are you on track to meet those? Your data should tell you. If it doesn't, you need to get better at collecting that data. And this will also help you identify different gaps that you have in your test coverage. There's loads of different coverage metrics that you could use. I talked about risk coverage already. There's just the basic test coverage, which is really looking at the number of manual tests that you have that are converted to an automated test. There's component coverage, which is more of a new topic, but you're really thinking about the percentage of your custom components like LWCs or Aura that are covered by testing. And metadata coverage as well. So metadata is probably the more granular one here, but we can really look at the actual custom metadata in our org and which percentage of that is covered by testing. This is something you can track over time. Another big point here, and this is specific for test automation, maintenance requirements. A lot of times you may have to come back to a test case and tweak it or get it working or constantly, kind of fix it based on the release that you're doing. So the time spent on fixing tests is something that hopefully should be going down over time and not up. Really, that's the only guidance here. Also, false negatives and false positives. Are tests continually failing because they should be failing? Or is your environment unstable or your test broken? These are things that you want to be thinking about. And again, this should be going down over time. And really the central goal here is just to continuously be improving. You've bought something, you've implemented test automation, you've had it for a year, things are going well, but you want to continue to move that bar, right? You don't want to say you've met your first year of 80% test coverage and that's where we're going to stay forever. You want to continuously excel and improve based on your evaluation criteria. So you always want to be coming back to that and evaluating it regularly. Okay, something I'm very passionate about, CI/CD integration. And this wasn't meant to be the last point, so don't think of that it's the last on the list, right? It's something you definitely want to be thinking about early on. But I'm really talking about kind of the long-term applications of it. So I mentioned shifting left, right? Testing earlier on, which is really just getting quicker feedback to the development team. Hey, this is working properly. you're all familiar with kind of that feedback loop, right? Now the shifting right is kind of the opposite of that. This is more about testing real world conditions and testing more in production-like environments. So we're really interested into how things actually behave once they've been deployed to production, rather than just testing in a QA environment where things may work one way, but then once it gets to prod, maybe everything breaks and we don't know why. So testing those integrations is very important. So testing in a CI/CD pipeline is something that can definitely help you with that. Okay, all of that being said, I'm gonna move now into transitioning into more of Provar product suite. So we talked about how we can go from being a manual testing team to an automated testing team. Allow me now to introduce our quality lifecycle management solutions. So when I say that word, you're probably like, what does that mean? By now, everyone's kind of familiar with SDLC and application lifecycle management. It's similar to that. Really, we're just thinking more about how we manage the entire lifecycle of the software development lifecycle process from the quality perspective. And that's really the only difference. So first, there's Provar Manager. This is our Salesforce native app. It's a quality hub for Salesforce. What we mean by that is this is really the centralized hub for everything that deals with testing. So all of our test data will live here. All of our integrations to testing will live here. And this is where all the reporting happens. It also boasts several AI capabilities, such as the ability to generate test cases from user stories and a full root cause analysis report from an Apex test failure. Outside of that, Provar Automation is the one that you may or may not be familiar with. This is our bread and butter product. It's been around for 10 years. It's our intuitive approach to low-code automation. And essentially, it lets you test Salesforce how you use Salesforce. Lastly, there's Grid. This is more of our automation test at scale, where we're running tests in a cloud-based environment. And it really simplifies the implementation process. A lot of times when you adopt automation, you need somewhere to run it. That's what Grid gives you. Okay, so I think I'm finished now with my slides. So now we're going to shift over to a demo. Alrighty. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be editing an existing test case that I already have running on my machine. I've already ran this test several times as part of my pipeline, but I'm going to be adding some steps to it, and I'm going to be showing you how we add steps to an existing test case inside of Provar Test Builder. So as this loads up, on the right side of my screen here, this is your right? Yeah. The right side of my screen here, you'll see Test Builder. On the left side, you'll see the UI. So essentially, it allows you to interact with the user interface and add steps to your test case directly there. So it's very declarative in that sense. This first step here, this Salesforce connection step, takes care of a lot of things for me out of the box. It'll open up my browser, as you noticed. It logged me in to Salesforce based on the user I specified. And it also takes me to the desired application that I'm testing immediately. From there, I've created some variables that I'm going to be referencing later. And I've also created a broker record using a SQL query. So that's going to be referenced as part of this test. Following with my best practice, I'm creating a record that I'm going to be using rather than using an existing one. Okay, so these first few steps here are just setting some fields down here in this little flow. And I'm going to be right-clicking on the next button and selecting Add to Test Case. This is how Test Builder works. Essentially, you just right-click on the field that you want to interact with, select Add to Test Case, and then Test Builder will load the element details over here. You can change the interaction type if you don't want to interact with it in the default way, and then you can just click Add and Do. What that's going to do is two things. It's going to add the step, and it's also going to perform that interaction on the page. So it's very intuitive in that sense, and it also gives you the instant feedback. So you know your test is working right away, rather than maybe the more traditional method in Selenium, where you're coding something and you're building out a test automation test case, and then you run it, see how it works. If it fails, okay, I gotta go back and rewrite the code, run it again. This is very kind of lockstep with what you may be doing. All right, so I'm gonna continue filling in my fields here. Just gonna provide the address information. So I'll right-click on the country field there and add it to my test case. And this is a screen flow, so we can actually populate all these fields in one step here. So I'll just provide my variables that I created. If I can read those from here, this is the country value, or street, sorry. I'll provide one from the city as well. We have our state. We have our country. And I'm just using variables that I created earlier. Again, not using static data in my test is always a best practice. Okay, so I've provided all those fields, and it'll basically fill in all the details at once in that single step. So we'll see that happening in just a second here in Test Builder. And then we can continue on. I'll right-click on my next button here, and we'll add this step as well. So as I'm building out this flow, you can kind of see maybe some light bulbs are going off, how you might design a flow using Test Builder in your application, where you're kind of thinking about what's the user journey for a process. You kind of just follow that, right? So whatever the user would be doing, we're just adding those as individual steps to a test case. And again, the recognition of the elements is all kind of happening behind the scenes. You see here, I'm not having to define any locators. I'm not having to tell it where these elements are in terms of the XPath or the label. It's not referencing like the name of the field or anything like that. And the reason for that is those are all things that can change pretty rapidly, and they're not necessarily reliable when it comes to automation. So instead, we use the metadata for the org that we're connected to reliably test it. I'm going to perform an upload here for this property. Just going to upload a picture. So we have a custom interaction type for that. And it's already set here to upload files, so I just need to type in the name for that. If I type in the name correctly, I can hardly see that down there. Hopefully no typos there. If I got that in correctly, should upload that file. So that file upload is just going to put the picture on the property record for me, and then I'll be able to create this property. There we go. Now we can click Finish. So I'll right-click on the Finish button here. And we have the option to take a screenshot before and after every step that executes in the UI. So we'll see that option down here. This is maybe for reporting purposes. You want to have this whenever you're doing a transition from one screen to the next. However, if there is a failure on any UI test step, it will automatically capture a screenshot. So you'll see that screenshot in the actual report whenever you go to look at it at a later time. All right, so we've clicked Finish here, and it's going to create this property record. Once that's done, it will navigate us, of course, to the property view screen. Now from here, this is where you might add in some different validations or assertions to your test to make sure fields are the appropriate value, or maybe you want to perform some kind of post-processing on this record, whatever the case may be. So if I right-click on this broker field here, I can add that to my test case, and we'll see I can change the interaction type to read assert. And I can assert a load of different things about this element, such as the label, if there's any kind of validation warnings, I can actually validate those as part of my test. And I can also assert different HTML attributes, like is that element visible for that user? Is it read-only? Those kinds of things. But for here, I just want to check the value. And rather than using James Smith hard-coded, again, I have my variables that I can reference. So I have my name field here, and I'll click Add and Do. So this is just going to add a simple UI assert step to my test case, just to validate that that field is the appropriate value based on the variable that I provided. And I can add maybe one more validation for the address. So I'll check assert value, and I'll change this to be the street variable that I had created. And I'll click Add and Do. So that's it. For this test case, I think we've added all of our necessary steps. We've added a couple of validations. We've added some UI assertions in there. Now I can just go ahead and tell Test Builder I'm done. So I'll just click Resume here. And we'll close out of this window here. So here's my test case. Here's what it actually looks like on the back end. I can open up Test Builder again, and I can, of course, add edit steps directly there. I can delete and copy or add, edit all these steps from the back end as well if I want to change values or add SQL queries to my test case. All of that is applicable. So you can combine UI and API components to your test. But the next thing I want to do is I want to run this in my environment in the cloud. So I'm going to upload this test case into our Salesforce application. I already have it there, but I'm going to upload the changes. So you see here it shows changed. So I'll just select that one there and click upload. So all the changes that I made to this test case will be uploaded into Salesforce, as well as any of the metadata coverage that that test case had. So if there's any metadata components that that test was interacting with, those will be uploaded as related records into Salesforce. Once all of that's synced into Salesforce, this allows us to not only run it directly from Salesforce inside of our cloud-based infrastructure, but it also enables the reporting aspect. So we can see all the test execution history, and we can create a test plan schedule to run those tests. And it looks like the Wi-Fi gods have blessed me, and that went through. So I'll open up this test case directly from here. And naturally, it would open on my other browser. So automation and manager work very seamlessly together. So I can navigate directly to the record inside of Salesforce to see what it looks like. This is the same test case that I just created. These are all the test steps here, so I can expand this to see the steps that I've added, and we can see all the data that it's using as well. So here's all my test steps. On the left-hand side, this is kind of an overview of my test project. So it'll show you all the test plans that I have created in this test project. We can look at the test cases here. We can also look at individual test execution history. So if I look at the executions for the tests that I'm working on now, we can see the latest result for each environment. So in the dev environment, we have a recent pass at 1 a.m. I don't know who was running it at 1 a.m. Definitely wasn't me. You can also see the average execution time for the test and then the drill down of individual execution records here. So if we look at a test plan, this is where we would go to create a schedule to run these test cases. Now I already have a schedule that's been created for the dev environment, which you can see where I'm running the tests on dev. You can also see historical data for the test plan itself, which will show you the pass rate and the duration of those runs. Well, let me go into our test plan schedule here, where I can show this information. So from this particular test plan, we can go into our settings to see how this test plan was configured. And this is where we would run the test on multiple browsers and platforms in our platforms tab here, where we can select the different combination that we want these tests to run. We can also configure a different number of threads. If we have multi-threading, we can enable that here. And there's also an AI-based test split, where it'll basically take previous test results and intelligently determine how to split those tests to run them more efficiently. Okay, so that's how the test plan has been configured there, and we already have some execution history here. Now we can enable this test to run on a schedule. We can run it on demand directly here at the top, and our schedule is currently set for 1 a.m., so that's why it ran last night. But if I check in my project from here, I can actually run this test case directly from a check-in to GitHub. So that's what I want to do. So I have my updates for that test case here inside of Provar, and I'll just say updated test. And once I commit and push this, basically what's going to happen is it's going to push this into my repository, and it's also going to trigger those test cases to run because I'm connected to that test plan schedule. So that'll show up in just a moment. Basically, we have a jobs tab here. Well, that test plan will be kicked off in just a minute, but essentially once that starts, it'll run the new test cases in the test plan schedule settings that we set. And we are getting alerts from these test plans as well. So this one's gonna send me an email when it's done. I also have a Slack webhook, so it's gonna post to my Slack channel so I can see the results there. And of course, there's a different number of reports and dashboards that are available that we can look at. Probably the most high level and easily to talk through in maybe 30 seconds or so is the quality center. So this one's just gonna show us a breakdown of all the test environments over time and how they're performing, so we can look at our dev environment. And we can see kind of our test execution. If we want to look at the performance for this month, we can see what's passed or failed over time, kind of the breakdown by browser and different things like that. Okay, so let me switch back over to our presentation and I'll wrap up here very quickly. So first and foremost, I showed you in Test Builder how we can edit an existing automated test, right? Very simple point and click declarative interface. Then I showed you how we could sync that test into Salesforce and Git using Provar automation. Next, combining Manager and Grid, we were able to create a test plan schedule and run those tests on a schedule and get reports into Salesforce. So all that came from there. I would like to leave you all at last with a quote from the co-founder and CQO of Abstracta. As ironic as it seems, the challenge of a tester is to test as little as possible. Test less, but test smarter. Thank you very much, everyone. And that is all for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.